Thank you, Mr. H, for sending me such a meaningful story by email. Today, Dust and Destiny will share with you a true tale based on the letter he entrusted to our channel. By the dry bed of the Arroyo Can, where the wind whistles through thorn and cactus, a lone rider named Naichi reined in his Mustang. Something rough and shapeless had snagged beneath a twisted root, a burlap sack soaked by the shallow stream. At first it seemed like refuse left to rot in the current, but when his knife cut through the rope, a hand the color of ash slipped out, and a faint, broken whisper rose into the air. Mama. The West is never short of brutal sights, but even the hardest men of San Dismas would have faltered at that moment. The frontier town sat on the edge of red mesas and dry canyons, a place where law bent beneath the weight of money, and justice often wore the face of whoever held the largest ranch or the fattest purse. In its saloon, El Coyote, arguments were settled more by pistols than by courts. And into this unforgiving landscape rode Naichi, an Apache guide in his mid-30s, who kept to himself and spoke little. He had once been a husband and a father. His wife Tala had succumbed to fever years ago, and their infant son had followed her into the grave before he had learned to speak. Grief had carved Naichi into silence, leaving him a man of few words and guarded eyes, dark as the mesa night. He earned his living repairing fences for the Lark's cattle spread, mending wire and leading travelers through arroyos no map cared to note. He had vowed never again to let his heart soften, until this moment at the arroyo changed him forever. Naichi lifted the sack, heavy with water and despair. Inside lay a girl, perhaps 9 months old, her skin pale, lips blue as winter sky. Her breaths came shallow, rattling like dry leaves in the wind. Without hesitation, he pulled the blanket from his saddle, wrapped her tightly, and pressed her small body against his chest. With one hand holding the child and the other on the reins, he spurred his horse toward San Dismas. Every pounding hoofbeat echoed the faltering rhythm of her breaths. "Mama," the child moaned again, weaker this time, as though her voice might vanish into the dust. Naichi gritted his teeth. He had buried enough ghosts. He would not bury this one. The ride into town was a blur of flying dust and searing sun. When Naichi burst through Main Street, townsfolk turned their heads from trading posts and wagons. Few trusted in Apache. Fewer still had seen him ride like a storm, a bundle clutched to his chest as though it were treasure or dynamite. He ignored their stares, pushing straight to a narrow, whitewashed building at the corner, Dr. Elena Stone's clinic. Elena was a widow, her husband long gone to cholera. Years of tending wounds, birthing children, and standing firm in the face of ranch feuds had hardened her, but not enough to hide her compassion. She was known for blunt words and steady hands. That morning, as the wall clock ticked slow against the silence, Elena looked up to see Naichi rush through her door with a bundle dripping creek water on the floorboards. "She's cold," he rasped, placing the child upon the table. Elena's eyes widened at the sight. Tiny limbs stiff, skin clammy. She bent close, her breath brushing against the girl's lips. Faint warmth lingered, but the chest rose only in fragile tremors. The clock struck another hollow note. Time was running thin. "Help me," Elena ordered. She wrapped the baby in thick cloth, placed warm stones around her, checked her pulse with trembling precision. "We need another pair of hands." From outside, she called for Maria Vega, the border school teacher passing by. Maria entered with surprise etched on her face. She was in her 30s, a woman whose smile had dimmed since losing her own daughter to smallpox years earlier. The sight of the infant near death struck her like a knife. For a moment, Maria faltered, her feet rooted by grief reborn. But Elena's sharp tone pulled her back. "Maria, hold her head steady. Keep her eyes open." Naichi stood silent against the wall, his fists clenched, watching the two women fight for the tiny life he had carried from the arroyo. The girl coughed once, weak and broken, but the sound stirred the room with hope. The clock ticked louder. Outside, the dust wind howled as if the desert itself bore witness. The child's eyelids fluttered. Her lips formed again the smallest syllable, "Mama," before slipping into faintness once more. The question remains, one I now ask you who listen. If it had been you that day, riding along the arroyo and seeing only a burlap sack drifting in the muddy water? Would you have stopped? Or would you have pressed on, telling yourself it was nothing more than trash? The 3 nights that followed were the longest in memory for those inside Dr. Elena Stone's small clinic. San Dismas lay quiet under the stars, but behind the clinic's whitewashed walls, the air was heavy with fever heat, the hiss of kerosene lamps, and the fragile sound of an infant's struggling breath. Naichi did not leave his post by the door. He stood as still as carved stone, arms folded across his chest, his black eyes fixed on the table where the child lay. Each shallow breath from the tiny girl seemed to drag him deeper into memories he had tried for years to bury. Tala, his beloved wife, taken by sickness. The infant son they had buried together, marked only by a crude cross of mesquite wood. He had sworn then that his heart would never soften again. Yet now, against every vow, that old pain stirred alive, for he could not look at the child without feeling the ache of what he had lost. Maria Vega remained at the child's side, bathing her with warm cloths, humming broken lullabies in Spanish, her hands trembling as though afraid to hold on too tight. She had been a teacher once filled with laughter, but smallpox had stolen her daughter years ago, and with her, Maria's voice. To cradle another infant seemed unthinkable, until the moment this child's lips moved and a faint "ma" escaped. The word was incomplete, no more than a whisper. Still, it brought Maria's eyes brimming with tears. It was the same sound her own baby had once made before the sickness silenced her forever. Elena worked with the calm of long experience, though lines of worry marked her face. She heated stones and wrapped them in cloth, checked the child's pulse again and again, listened for any strength in her chest. At times the breaths were so faint she feared the end was near. The wall clock ticked slow and hollow, measuring the distance between life and death. Then on the 3rd morning something changed. The child stirred, her fingers curling against Maria's sleeve. Her color improved slightly, a fragile rose returning to her cheeks. She whimpered once and then quieted when Maria held her close. The sigh that left Maria's lips carried both sorrow and relief, like a woman who had been drowning and suddenly tasted air. Naichi stepped forward then, looking down at the girl. On the table beside her lay a sprig of dried sage that Elena had burned to mask the odor of medicine. He picked it up, rolling the brittle leaves between his fingers. "Sage," he said simply, his voice low and solemn. "That will be her name." Maria met his eyes, and for the first time in years, she smiled through her tears. Sage, the plant of survival, of cleansing smoke, of stubborn roots that dug into barren soil. "Sage," she repeated softly. "It suits her." The infant opened her eyes then, no longer clouded with death but still weak, and looked at the two of them as though she already knew they were her guardians. It was a moment of fragile hope, but hope nonetheless, the kind that could grow roots in even the hardest desert ground. By the end of the week, San Dismas buzzed with whispers. The town thrived on rumor the way a saloon thrived on whiskey. At El Coyote, men hunched over poker tables, their voices low as they spoke of a baby found in the arroyo, pulled half dead from a sack. At the general store, women lowered their heads and whispered about who the child might belong to and why anyone would want to dispose of her. And always, behind their gossip, the same name floated: the Harridans. The Harridan family cast a long shadow across 3 counties. Richard Harridan, banker, rancher, and mine owner, had more power than the sheriff himself. His word could raise or ruin a man overnight, and if whispers said that the abandoned baby was somehow tied to his household, no one dared speak too loudly. Deputy Walt Pierce made the matter official. He nailed a notice to the post outside the jailhouse, $1,000 reward for information about a missing infant. When questioned, he gave little explanation, only that it was a family concern best left to the Harridans. He urged citizens to keep quiet, to let the family handle things with dignity. But dignity, Maria thought bitterly, was not what had been offered to the child in that sack. One evening, after closing the shutters of the schoolhouse, Maria was approached by a woman wrapped in a gray shawl. It was Luz Ortega, the Harridan housekeeper for nearly 2 decades. Her face was pale, her eyes darting as though even the night air might carry her words back to her master. "Señorita Vega," Luz whispered, "I cannot stay silent any longer. The child you care for, she is Miss Eliza's." "Eliza Harridan?" Maria asked, shocked. "Yes," Luz said with trembling voice. "She bore the baby in secret last year. Her father sent her away, telling the town she was being educated back east. When she returned, he announced the child was dead at birth. But I heard the truth. He paid a man to dispose of her. He said a bastard would shame the family, ruin his name. Better that the baby not live at all." Maria's stomach twisted. She thought of Sage's cold skin, her lips blue, her tiny voice still begging for mama. How could a father discard such a life for the sake of pride? Soon after, the threats began. Naichi discovered boot prints pressed into the mud outside the clinic, larger than a boy's, too deliberate to be chance. A scrap of paper was shoved under the door one morning. In crude handwriting it read, "Return what belongs to Harridan before it learns to speak." The danger was no longer rumor. It was a shadow pressing close. Inside, Elena Stone continued her work, but her face hardened. When Richard Harridan himself marched into the clinic with his daughter Eliza, demanding proof and examination, Elena obeyed her duty in silence. Eliza's eyes were downcast, her body tense under her father's iron stare. As Elena examined her arm, she uncovered faint bruises, the kind left by a grip too hard, too frequent. She met Eliza's gaze, but the young woman quickly looked away. The truth needed no words. It was written in the marks left on her skin. Meanwhile, Naichi bore the insults of town life. At El Coyote, men muttered openly that no Apache should raise a white child. Some spat near his boots, sneering, "Give her back to her own kind. What's an Apache know about raising her?" Maria's answer silenced them, if only for a heartbeat. And who was it that rode into the arroyo when others looked away? Who wrapped her in his blanket when she was dying? You drink and you gamble while he saved her life. The men grumbled, but could not refute her words. Prejudice lingered in the room, thick as smoke after a gunfight. Yet for that moment, the truth stood clear. Naichi himself said nothing. Words he knew rarely changed the minds of white men. He carried himself with the same silent dignity as always, but inside his resolve grew stronger. This child was alive because of him. No threats, no gossip, no family name would strip that away. Thus the conflict took shape, plain for all to see. On one side stood Richard Harridan and his dynasty, armed with money, law, and reputation, ready to claim back the child they had once abandoned. On the other stood an Apache and a widowed teacher, tied by no blood but by the kind of love forged only in the darkest of nights. The townsfolk whispered and waited, uncertain which would prevail. Some believed blood must always win. Others, softened by the sight of Sage in Maria's arms, wondered if perhaps love had a greater claim. And now, as you listen to this tale across the years, I put the same question to you. When family honor collides with the life of an innocent child, which should weigh heavier on the scales, blood or mercy? The courthouse in San Dismas had never known such a crowd. By the time the sun climbed high above the red mesas, men and women filled every pew, pressed shoulder to shoulder, their whispers thick as the desert dust. Even the windowsills held onlookers craning for a glimpse of the drama about to unfold. At the bench sat Judge Amos Parker, a man with a silver beard, stern eyes, and the kind of patience born from decades of settling disputes between cattlemen, miners, and drifters. But as he lifted his gavel, the room hushed. Everyone understood. This was no ordinary quarrel over land or cattle. This was a fight for a child's life. On one side of the chamber, Richard Harridan sat stiff in a black coat, silver-headed cane in hand, his presence commanding the room as much as the wealth behind him. At his elbow, the attorney Whitcomb of Dallas adjusted his polished waistcoat, a gleaming silver pin fastening his tie. He was known for his silver tongue, a man who could turn a lie into scripture. Across from them sat Naichi, shoulders square, dust still clinging to his shirt, the strength of the desert etched into every line of his face. Beside him, Maria Vega held the baby, Sage, bundled against her breast. The little girl's dark eyes flickered from face to face, unaware that her very future would be decided in this room. Their counsel, Tom Bradley, looked modest in comparison. A small-town lawyer, coat worn at the elbows, spectacles slightly crooked. But his jaw was set firm, his loyalty plain. The gavel cracked. "This hearing will come to order," Judge Parker declared. Whitcomb rose smoothly, bowing his head just enough to suggest respect. His voice carried across the courtroom, smooth and cold. "Your Honor, this case is straightforward. The child in question is the granddaughter of my client, Mr. Richard Harridan. Blood, heritage, and law are clear. She belongs with her family. In their home, she will receive every advantage: proper care, education, security. No Apache guide or impoverished schoolteacher can provide such things. Whatever kindness they imagine they have shown, it does not outweigh the rights of kin." He paused, letting the words sink in. Murmurs rippled through the benches. He gestured gracefully toward Naichi and Maria. "We must not let sentiment cloud reason. Blood calls to blood. The child must be restored." Tom Bradley stood slowly, tugging at his collar. His voice lacked Whitcomb's polish, but it rang with conviction. "Your Honor, this child was not lost. She was discarded. She was tied in a feed sack and cast into the arroyo like garbage. And it was Naichi who pulled her out, Maria who nursed her, Dr. Stone who fought to keep her alive. For weeks they have cared for her, protected her, loved her. That bond, formed in the darkest of hours, cannot be erased by money or family name." He turned to the judge, his voice rising. "The law speaks of the best interest of the child. Can anyone here claim that being thrown away to die was in her best interest? And should those who abandoned her now claim her back as if she were property?" A rumble of agreement swept the crowd. Judge Parker lifted his hand for silence. The first witness was Eliza Harridan. She walked slowly to the stand, pale and trembling, her eyes fixed on the floor. Her father's glare burned into her, but when she raised her hand to take the oath, her voice cracked. "Miss Harridan," Whitcomb began softly, "tell us your relation to the child." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "She is my daughter." The room gasped. Eliza pressed on, words tumbling out between sobs. "I was told she died at birth. My father said it was best, that no one could know. When I resisted, he locked me in my room for weeks. He struck me. He made me sign papers I didn't understand. I thought she was gone forever." Richard Harridan slammed his cane on the floor. "Silence, girl. Lies." But Eliza did not stop. "I wanted her, I still do, but I was powerless." Next came Dr. Elena Stone. She entered with her medical ledger, spectacles perched firm. "I delivered Miss Harridan's child 9 months ago. The dates match precisely with when Sage was found. Furthermore, the rope tied around the sack matches a coil purchased by the Harridan Ranch. Receipts, provided by housekeeper Luz Ortega, confirm it." The crowd muttered again. Whitcomb leapt up, objecting that the evidence was circumstantial, but Judge Parker waved him down. "The testimony stands," he said. Then Luz Ortega herself took the stand. Her hands shook as she clutched her shawl. "I served the Harridan family for nearly 20 years. I heard Senor Harridan pay a man to remove the baby. He said shame would ruin the family. I should have spoken sooner. God forgive me." Harridan shouted, his face red. "You dare betray me?" But the gavel struck, silencing him. The final witness sealed the matter. Carl Jensen, a miner, shuffled forward, hat in hand. His voice broke as he confessed. "I was the one they paid. I took the sack to the arroyo. I heard the child cry inside. I hesitated. But the money..." He hung his head. "The money kept me quiet. I can still hear that cry every night." The silence that followed was heavier than gun smoke after a duel. In that silence, Sage stirred. She wriggled from Maria's lap, pulling herself to her feet with uncertain balance. The court froze as the little girl looked up at Maria and spoke clearly. "Mama." A collective breath swept the room. Then, wobbling forward, she reached her arms toward Naichi, her lips forming the word he had once whispered to her in Apache. "Ta'a." "Father." Gasps broke into murmurs. A few wiped tears from their eyes. Naichi knelt, catching her in his arms, his rough hands trembling with gentleness. In that moment, the truth was clearer than any testimony. Richard Harridan's face contorted with rage. He slammed his cane again. "Blood of Harridan does not wander. She is ours by right." Whitcomb scrambled, his words sharp. "Children adapt, Your Honor. With proper care, she will forget these misplaced attachments. She can bond anew with her family." Judge Parker studied Naichi, dust on his boots, scars on his hands, but eyes steady, unflinching. Here stood a man who had no wealth, no power, only the stubborn courage of love. The gavel struck once. "I have heard enough." The judge's voice carried the weight of justice long delayed. "The court acknowledges Miss Eliza Harridan as the child's mother, but this is not a case of property. It is a case of life. The best interest of the child must prevail." He looked at Sage, now nestled in Naichi's arms. She has known their care, their protection, their love. To strip her from that would be cruelty. The decision fell like thunder. "I grant guardianship to Naichi and Maria Vega, first temporary, then full. Miss Eliza may seek visitation, provided it is of her own will and without coercion. Further, I order a criminal investigation into the actions of Richard Harridan and all parties complicit in this crime." The gavel slammed. "This court is adjourned." The courtroom erupted. Cheers rose from the benches. Others gasped in shock. Eliza wept openly, relief mingled with grief. Harridan roared, "This is outrage! My name will not be shamed!" But his voice was drowned beneath the swell of the crowd. Naichi stood, Sage clinging to him, Maria at his side. For the first time in many years, a quiet peace crossed his weathered face. And so, listeners, I ask you, do you believe that the bonds of a child's earliest memory, the first arms she trusts, the first voices she calls Mama and Papa, should be honored by law as much as bloodlines? Should those attachments born of survival and love count as a kind of spiritual kinship as binding as heritage itself? When the verdict was delivered, the crowd poured into the streets of San Dismas. Some muttered in disbelief, but many cheered. For once, justice had not bowed to money. In the days that followed, the dust began to settle, and life found a new rhythm, though not the same as before. Naichi led Maria and little Sage to the edge of Mescal Hill, where his cabin stood against the backdrop of the desert sky. It was no mansion, no banker's estate, only weathered timbers, a stone hearth, and a roof patched more than once with hides. Yet here, Naichi felt the weight on his chest ease. He set a small table by the window, and on it placed a sprig of sage, dried and brittle, the same plant that had given the child her name. He lit a small fire, murmured words in his native tongue, and offered thanks to the spirits of his people. It was not triumph he felt, but humility. For in Apache tradition, to save a life is not to claim ownership, but to accept responsibility before the ancestors. He whispered to Tala's memory, asking her to watch over this child as she had once watched over their lost son. The town of San Dismas began to change as well. At first, some still looked sideways at Naichi. Old prejudices died slow in the desert. Yet when they saw him walking through town with Sage perched on his shoulders, laughing at the jingling bells he tied to her wrists, the whispers grew softer. Children, unburdened by their parents' suspicions, ran after him shouting, "Naichi, tell us the story of the falling stars!" And more often than not, he would pause, Sage giggling on his arm, to recount the tale of meteors streaking the sky, spirits lighting the path of warriors gone before. The man who had once been a shadow now became, if not embraced, at least respected. Not because the town had shed all its prejudice, but because he had shown them a strength no money could buy. Eliza Harridan, too, began a quiet transformation. Stripped of her father's protection, she chose to leave the mansion on the hill. She found work at Maria's schoolhouse, first as a helper, then as a teaching assistant. Her hands, once idle in luxury, grew calloused from chalk and paper. Each week she came to visit Sage under supervised eyes. At first she trembled, afraid even to lift her daughter, as though the weight would expose her as unworthy. But Maria guided her gently, showing her how to cradle the child, how to sing softly to ease her fussing. Over time, Eliza's fear gave way to something steadier. The harsh echoes of her father's voice no longer dictated her every move. For the first time, she began to smile without shame. Meanwhile, the great Richard Harridan saw his empire crumble. Ranchers withdrew their funds from his bank, unwilling to trust a man who had tried to bury his own blood for the sake of pride. The silver mine faltered as workers walked away. Prosecutors from the capital opened inquiries into his dealings. His name, once a shield, became a brand of disgrace. He railed against it all, striking the marble floors of his estate with his cane, but the town no longer bowed to his thunder. In her clinic, Dr. Elena Stone carried on her work with the same steady hands. Yet something in her had softened. On the wall she pinned a photograph, a rare treat, captured by a traveling photographer, of Sage laughing at the window, her tiny teeth showing. Beneath it, Elena wrote in careful script, "Some heartbeats cannot be measured by a stethoscope. They are heard only in the eyes of the one who is loved." Life in the cabin was not without hardship. One night, a sandstorm rolled off the mesas, hammering the roof until the timbers groaned. The lantern flickered, shadows leaping across the walls. Maria clutched the light as Naichi gathered Sage into his arms, holding her close while the wind howled like spirits outside. "The West will always test those who make promises," Maria said quietly, watching him rock the child. Naichi only nodded. "And we will always keep them." When dawn came, the roof still stood and Sage awoke smiling, her curls wild with dust. Months passed, and the seasons turned. On the day Sage reached her second birthday, neighbors gathered at the cabin to celebrate. A simple cake was baked, its candles glowing in the twilight. The little girl closed her eyes, her cheeks puffing as she blew out the flames. Then she declared in a voice clear enough for all to hear, "I don't need a wish. I already have Mama, Ta'a, and a home that smells like sage." Laughter and tears filled the room. For those present, it was a moment that needed no more testimony than that. And so Sandismus carried on, its scars showing, but its heart changed a little for the better. The story of Sage, of the Apache who rescued her, and of the women who fought for her life became part of the town's living memory, told and retold in saloons and front porches alike. But I ask you now, listener, when powerful men use money and family pride to place themselves above the law, what should a community do? Should it cast them out forever, or allow them the chance to repent? In the end, the story of Sage did not echo because of wealth, nor because of bloodlines traced in ledgers. It endured because in a world of dust and wind, two ordinary souls chose not to look away. Naichi never called himself a hero. He simply lived by a promise older than law. When you meet someone weaker, do not turn aside. Maria answered that promise in her own way. When you meet someone alone, call them by their name. And together, in the cabin on Mescal Hill, they gave Sage more than food or shelter. They gave her a family. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, Sage stood on tiptoe beneath the porch beam. Her little fingers reached up, brushing the sprig of dried sage that hung there as blessing and reminder. She laughed, the sound carrying into the open desert air, as though to say she understood the meaning of her name. Survival, healing, hope. That image remains, the child smiling beneath the desert sky, her laughter untamed, her future no longer chained to shame or power. And what lesson lingers for us listeners of Dust and Destiny? That blood is the root, but love and safety are the true home. That honor is not found in concealing sin, but in facing it, even when it scars a family's pride. That a man judged by prejudice can still rise as a pillar of dignity, holding more weight than the wealthy who scorn him. In Sandismus, a court gavel fell and justice was served. But in truth, the greater victory came not from law, but from hearts willing to keep a child alive through nights of fear and storms of doubt. So I leave you with this thought. In a land where men believed power was a rope strong enough to pull all things their way, that rope could never bind the heart of a child. True justice stands not with the purse or the name, but with the hands that carried her through the long, dark night. If this story has touched you, I invite you to follow Dust and Destiny. Share it so others may hear. Press like if you believe compassion is stronger than hollow pride. And in the comments below, tell us, in a courtroom between blood and love, which should weigh heavier? And if you carry a story of your own, do not hesitate to send it to us by email. One day your tale might help someone standing on the windswept edge of despair, searching for hope.